Thank you guys all for coming. Good evening. I'm Ben Smith, the editor of BuzzFeed, and I'll take it. I think that will be the only applause I get all night. And we'd like to thank you for coming to our BuzzFeed Brews Special Edition Immigration Summit. We've been doing a series of these this year as one-on-one interviews and having a lot of fun with them, and we're really excited to be expanding this to focus on an issue, to focus on immigration tonight, which is, I think, really the most interesting issue of the year. In a moment, I'll introduce the participants in our first panel, but first, a word from the event's sponsor, the Charles Koch Institute.
Thanks, Ben.
No applause for this guy? You don't have to apply.
Hello. Welcome all to the event tonight. My name is Jordan Bruno. I'm a policy analyst at the Charles Koch Institute. I'm glad you could join us for tonight's panel on immigration. This is a vital topic for the future of our nation. Everyone in this country, policymakers, opinion leaders, scholars, the public at large, should want to advance our understanding of good immigration policy. Tonight's event is designed to do just that, and to serve as a springboard for important new analysis and discovery in this area. In our view, history and research show that a free society is the best way to advance societal progress and well-being. That's why we at the Charles Koch Institute devote so much effort through our research and educational programs to protecting and advancing our economic, political, and civil freedoms. As Americans are beginning to see more and more, immigration and labor policy can have a huge impact on progress and prosperity too. Through this event, we want to ask which immigration policy best advances societal well-being. The Charles Koch Institute welcomes the scholarship and analysis that is being done to inform the current immigration debate. This is an area that will benefit from a lively discussion and a diverse range of viewpoints. Tonight's panel discussion is part of that process. And now I'll hand it back over to Ben. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thanks, Jordan. Jordan is actually a very controversial figure, which is why, as you may have noticed, a large police presence in this neighborhood in this neighborhood tonight. And so I guess I'd like to introduce our panel. Before I do, there's a empty seat. Jose Antonio Vargas, the Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist, will be live tweeting this, I think initially from the Amtrak. But we hope he'll join us a bit later on Twitter with the hashtag BuzzFeed Brews and immigration. You can follow him at Jose is Writing, testing at least the live stream capacities of Amtrak. Starting on our panel from left to right, and we're so glad to have you guys. This is Clarissa Martinez, the Director of Immigration and National Campaigns at the National Council of La Raza, where she oversees the organization's work on immigration and efforts to expand Latino engagement in civic life and public policy debates. Next is Mario Lopez, President and founder of the Hispanic Leadership Fund, and served on the Hispanic Advisory Board for the RNC, was Executive Director of the Congressional Hispanic Conference, also the author of a recent really interesting report casting the anti-immigration forces as a bunch of lunatic left-wing environmentalists. Next to him is Alex Nowrasteh, an immigration policy analyst at the Cato Institute, and previously the immigration policy analyst at the Competitive Enterprise Institute. Next to him, we have the only Democrat on the panel, Mickey Kaus, the author and journalist and iconoclast, one of my favorite people to fight with on the internet, and who's currently has a great blog with our friends at the Daily Caller. And trekked out from sunny Los Angeles, and we're so thrilled that you could join us. And I guess, to start the panel, I think there is a sense right now that there's an enormous amount of momentum for some kind of compromise. I think it was really notable today that when Steve King organized an event with anti-immigration congressmen, only 5 members of the very conservative Republican conference showed up to join him. And I guess I was sort of interested in where the outlines of a compromise are, and I thought I would start out for that with Clarissa and with Mickey. And I think people often assume that groups like La Raza, are behind whatever is happening, are going to sign off on whatever the compromise is. And I guess, and this is sort of pre-baked. And I wonder, I think this audience basically knows that there's the outlines of a path to citizenship, some kind of security measures, and it's all details. And I wonder, are there red lines for La Raza? Are there places that you feel like this bill could be pulled so far to the right that it's going to lose Democrats, as Marco Rubio tries to steer it tries to please Republicans?
Well, I think that it's very clear to anybody who's been following this debate that the immigration issue is slightly different than other issues in the sense that it doesn't cut cleanly across partisan lines the way other issues do. And I think that's why every time that immigration has either succeeded or failed, it's been both parties have had a hand in it. I think that, there are elements of this bill that were they standalone provisions we would be viscerally opposed to, just like many, 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 many other groups who are pushing immigration legislation forward would be in the same position. But I think that all of the different groups you can talk to, whether we're talking about labor or business or civil rights organizations, immigrant rights organizations, ethnic organizations, we all understand that there has to be some give from every single one of these pockets in order to come up with something that at the end of the day, the aggregate of that is going to be for the greater good. And the reality is that the way we're looking at this is sort of in three parts. For us, a bill has to restore the rule of law, and to do that, you can't just keep doing enforcement. We've been doing that. Actually, legalization and the roadmap to citizenship are part and parcel of restoring the rule of law. But once you do that, you have to preserve it. And the way you preserve the rule of law is by having a functional legal immigration system. And I think there's a lot of changes that are coming in that regard. And last but not least, that to continue that path, you have to advance and be proactive about immigrant integration. Again, legalization and the roadmap to citizenship for us are part and parcel of restoring the rule of law. They're also a big civil rights issue for Latinos, 75% of whom are United States citizens. Yet when most people think about Latinos, they think of Latinos as immigrants and as undocumented immigrants. This has become a big civil rights issue. So we want to make sure it gets fixed. And for us, the success of reform is going to rest on really what is already a very narrow and hard path to make sure that it doesn't become impossible.
Are there poison pills that you see floating out there that would make it impossible for you?
There are. There are, we saw this in previous attempts in 2007 and previous debates where there's going to be amendments to try to put requirements for people to come forward that are either going to discourage people or are going to make it too expensive or are going to eliminate a number of people who should be deemed by their merits and their contributions. To the extent that you start adding those things up and you end up with a program that only far too few can get through, that is not real reform.
So Mickey, you, despite your being an iconoclast, I think are fairly, I think of you as pretty solidly in the long-time skeptic wing here. And I wonder, you've been watching this debate forever. Is there a specific place that you think there's room for negotiation, or are you just standing athwart history here?
Well, I sort of resist this idea that history flows inevitably in one direction here. We tried this before in '86. It didn't work by my lights. Some people say it did work. It didn't work because we got the amnesty but not the enforcement. So from my perspective, the goal is to prevent that from happening again. And the common ground here is that the 11 million, we're not going to deport them. I think they're a good force in American society. I think at some point I want amnesty. I want them to be legalized, and I want them to have full citizenship. So that's it's all a question of the timing. I thought the best, we just don't want to get snookered again by giving the amnesty and not getting the enforcement, so that in 10 years we have to have another amnesty for another 11 million. I thought Charles Krauthammer, for half a column, had a really good idea. He abandoned it halfway through, but which was guarantee amnesty if three things are done. If we have an E-Verify system that's in place, if we have a fence that's in place, and if we have a visa system that's in place, and I would add, survive the inevitable court challenges from the ACLU that will try to just knock it out, which is going to happen. If you did that, you could say, okay, we will guarantee from whatever mechanism you want that there will be an amnesty at the end of it. It's enforcement first, but it is amnesty second. So I think that's the common ground. I fear it is not acceptable to the other side.
That's a rare person who supports what they call amnesty in some form.
Well, even
Alex, well, so what do you think of that, Alex? That sounds pretty reasonable.
Well, we heard about the two parts of the 1986 bill that failed. We had an amnesty and we had enforcement. Well, there's a third part in this bill that I think distinguishes it from the 86 bill and that I'm most concerned about, and that is increasing lawful migration going forward. Now, I'm an optimist. I think most people who are going to come to this country as immigrants haven't come yet. I think we have a long future of immigration here, and what I want to do is fix the problem going forward, most importantly, so that we don't have to fix this. I mean, you say we didn't have an enforcement. I mean, we have 750% increase in Border Patrol appropriations to the southern border. We have 9 times as many Border Patrol officers now as in 1989. We have fences. We have, innumerable numbers of operations on the border to do this stuff. We have a beefed up internal enforcement through secure communities. We have 400,000 deportations a year. Under this administration, we have 3.5% of the unauthorized population deported every year, more than a full percentage over the Bush administration's years. The notion that we haven't done any enforcement is, I think, a ludicrous one. What we haven't tried in the modern era is increasing lawful immigration so that we can channel would-be unauthorized immigrants into the legal market going forward. Now, I don't think this bill goes far enough for that. I think the numbers are way too small. I think it's limited to way too few sectors of the economy. But that's a start going forward that I think distinguishes this dramatically from 1986.
That's right.
And another thing that that distinguishes from this, well, I guess more than from 86, from 2006, is the politics, and how and like the difficulty of finding the divisions in the Republican Party. And it seems to me the sort of centrality that Republican figures are taking in pushing this, and also in battling it out in the kind of Washington conversation, which you've been doing a lot of. And I wonder, is this? Do you feel that that's a real difference? Do you think it matters?
Yeah, absolutely. First, I do want to take another issue with something that Mickey said. In '86, we actually did have amnesty. That was true, God honest amnesty. You showed up, people. If you were here 4 years, I think 4 years or more, you were legalized. Okay, you were pardoned for the civil offense of illegal presence. This bill, and even in the 06-07 debates, that's not amnesty. You have punishments, you have fines, you have a way for people to basically get right with the law by saying, look, I did something bad, I did something that was against the law, and this is how we're going to make amends for it. So I truly believe that illegal presence, which is a civil offense, they're not criminals, that's a big myth that's out there, should not be the only civil offense for which there can be no atonement. So that's, I think, an important part of it. But that there should be a penalty that's called a penalty. Absolutely, and I think that's a big recognition. Now, getting back to your question about what's different now, I think that we've seen the business community engage more. I think that the faith community has engaged a lot more on this issue, and I think that you've seen smart Republicans like Marco Rubio say, look, we can't afford to not be a part of this debate and not have a hand in something that gets crafted, which goes to the very heart and soul of who we are as a country. And so I think that his efforts, and others, but I think he's done a great job leading the charge to educate conservatives and Republicans about why we are needed, why our voice is needed in this debate, and what can be done to make sure that we don't have a bill, another crazy Obamacare-style bill crafted by, in the back rooms, just like Obamacare was, and then forced down the throats of the American people. Steve
King said today that this would, in fact, be worse than Obamacare. If you guys could keep it down and back, that would be great, because there's a hotel bar around the corner. But I guess just to stay on the Republican Party for a second, it seems that, there are a lot of members of Congress who are obviously skeptical of this, whose constituents are probably skeptical, who did not show up today with Steve King. Like, what are you guys doing to keep them so divided, Mario?
Well, I think a big one portion is that
how are you sowing that dissent?
A recognition that some of the forces that have been very vocal, speaking out against all immigration, not just illegal immigration, but speaking out against all immigration, have ulterior motives. There are folks that 30 years ago committed themselves to having the U.S. population, their population control folks who are, because of their radical environmentalist beliefs, believe that more people are bad for the earth and more people are bad for the country. And as Grover Norquist has rightly pointed out, people are an asset, not a liability. And we have a long history of, on the right, of brilliant economists like Julian Simon, who was at Heritage when they were reasonable on this issue, and at Cato and other places, that have demonstrated this through their scholarly work. And I think that the recognition of that is also something that's different this time around.
We would have loved to have Heritage. They're having a very tough time at the moment on this one. I think there's this hope, some would say fantasy, some would say plan in the Republican Party, Clarissa, that this bill is going to change the politics of Latino Americans, and that this is sort of this, that this is at least the path towards winning national elections again. Do you think it is?
I don't think it's a fantasy. I mean, you can just look at the numbers that George Bush was able to get when he first got elected and when he got reelected, and see that it is not a fantasy. I think that Senator John McCain probably said it best. I believe it was him who said, look, if we pass immigration reform, it doesn't mean that we're done and we can go home and expect Latino votes. We're going to have to then build a relationship and work for that and make our case on other issues. But I think it is undeniable, again, particularly after the passage of SB 1070 in Arizona, which for the Latino community was clearly seen as a racial profiling law beyond immigration. It is very difficult to start a conversation about ideas with someone if the premise is that you are seeing largely the loudest voices from that party talking about how they want, a member of your family or your friend to leave. And not just that, about them being a drain in society and all sorts of ill things. It makes it very difficult to have a conversation about other issues. So I don't think it's a fantasy. I do believe that for Republicans, where Latino voters are concerned, they have been their own worst enemy and Democrats' best friend, right? Because they haven't really competed for the Latino vote with Democrats.
But when you cover American politics in a detailed way, it feels like La Raza is just like part of the Democratic coalition in such a fundamental way that, and the sort of institutional Latino groups that, it's sort of hard to see. I mean, I understand the sort of broad argument. It's very hard to see how a Republican presidential candidate wedges any sort of major portion of that community out in a more detailed way. I mean, is that you're not just kind of dangling this in front of them and.
Now, again, I think you can look at the facts and you can look at the figures. And Latino voters have demonstrated tendencies to do ticket splitting, where there's plenty of races, particularly before 2006, when I think that the anti-immigrant code was more clearly worn by the Republican Party all across, in Colorado, in New Mexico, in Florida, in Arizona, where Latinos would go to the polls and vote for one candidate in one race and one party, and for a candidate of another party in a different race. For organizations like ours, first of all, we're nonpartisan, but we do voter engagement work. We believe that it is in the best interest of our community to be courted by both parties. And frankly, I do think it's in the interest of our democracy to make sure that elected officials are being responsive to their constituencies regardless, right? And hopefully that helps break the stalemate that we have. It is not a fantasy, but people have to work it. And that means that if Republicans start to work it, Democrats are also going to have to work it.
What do you think, Mickey? Is there immediate political gain in this?
I do think support for whatever you want to call it, legalization, whatever the comprehensive reform in the Republican Party is pretty much an elite phenomenon. They are convinced that the numbers work out in their favor. I don't think they want to win the Latino vote outright. They think they can reduce their losses. Latinos are a pretty democratic group. I think McCain was Captain Amnesty. He got 40% of the vote. That's not so good, And the problem for if you're a cynical Republican, in the process of legalizing the 11 million are here, you're also welcoming a whole bunch of new potential voters who are also going to be 60-40 Democratic. So it's not completely clear to me that the math works out in favor of Republicans. There are, apart from the elites, the Republicans are terrified. The Republican elites are terrified of the Republican voters. Otherwise, they wouldn't have crafted a bill that was entirely crafted to deceive Republican voters into thinking it was an enforcement bill when really it's not. I can go into chapter and verse, but the triggers are phony. The phony triggers are phony. It's phoniness stacked on top of phoniness. There is no trigger that stops people from advancing to the path to citizenship really on the basis of, well, we have to wait until we have the enforcement in place.
That chapter and
Is
verse
that fair, Mario? That there's not that there isn't a security trigger. There's no specific enforcement piece that has to fall into place first.
The chapter and verse that Mickey talks about is fiction. I mean, from his point of view, the triggers are there, and I heard Marco Rubio talking about this last night, and he says, you know, when you get restricted provisional immigrant status, I believe it's called, you just get a work authorization. You have to renew that. If you don't pass
but I think Mickey's not talking about triggers for individuals. He's saying that the path begins and that the legalization portion operates independently of the security portion.
Right, well, you have to have a way to identify folks, which is part of the issue, right? I mean, if you're not going to identify folks by just saying, you know, come tell us that you're here illegally, and then, you know, we're going to write down who you are and where you live, and then that's that, right? I mean, you have to offer something.
But here's another thing. I gotta jump in on this. I think for far too long, there's been folks who wrap themselves on enforcement and claim the rule of law mantle, and have posited the situation as if imposing a road to legality for folks who are here undocumented is sort of a giveaway in exchange for the hard enforcement pieces. And that is just ridiculous. The notion that you can have a population of 10 to 11 million people that lives in the shadows, that is beyond the scope of the law, and that then you can restore the rule of law by continuing to spend $18 billion in immigration enforcement and such, it's just ridiculous. You need to clean the deck. If we're really serious about restoring the rule of law, if we are serious about law and order, then one would argue that if it serves you better, and I think Secretary Napolitano has made that case, that you can focus your resources to go after really bad apples and threats to national security and public safety. If you get folks who are simply here working and supporting their families and separate those out, right? Yeah, so that is actually the law and order argument. And I think there's been this mythology created about, you know, who is for law and order and who isn't. And right now, we're starting to finally take that apart.
I'm not making
I don't think you guys disagree here.
I think we do. I'm not making a law and order argument. I'm arguing that we don't want another 11 million after this one. That's not law and order. I care about working Americans who will have their wages driven down by immigrant competition. I care about underclass Americans. You know, we had a Welfare Reform Act. We told people, go out and get a job, any job, and you'll make a decent wage. You'll be able to live a life of dignity. You can't do that if the entire third world is going to march into basic unskilled wages.
That's basically what Cato wants, right?
Yeah,
I mean, that's a very pure libertarian argument. Really, just open the borders.
That's a pure libertarian argument. But the notion that more people are bad for the economy is
I don't think that's what Mickey's saying. He's saying that more
people.
Means
more people are going to lower the wages for low income Americans.
But isn't that?
People who are
but doesn't Cato believe in race basically having lower wages for some jobs and more competition for those jobs?
Well, what Cato believes is that we should have a market-driven immigration system where supply and demand determine the numbers and not central planners in Washington, D.C.
So you're okay with lower wages?
What I'm okay with is taking a look at the data. And the data shows that over the decades of immigration, the most pessimistic data out there in an academic journal by a reputable economist, George Borjas, shows that about 30 million immigrants over the last 20-plus years have at most driven down the wages for people with less than a high school degree by 4.7%. If we're really, really worried about people, Americans who are adults, who have less than a high school degree, having their wages driven down, there are much cheaper and easier ways to help those individuals than distorting international labor markets with socialistic regulations that stop the flow of labor.
If you care, absolutely. Absolutely. And if you care about the poor,
That's
and if
the
you
Koch
care
folks.
about the poor and the working class, the best thing that you can do is you can have a free market economic system, you can have school choice, you can have lower barriers to entry, you can have policies that benefit small business. Hispanics we have 2 million Hispanic-owned small businesses in this country because nothing has helped poor people rise out of poverty and attain economic success like capitalism. There's no government program in the history of the world that has done what capitalism has done to decrease poverty and to increase prosperity in the world.
Seems like we have a pro-capitalist crowd here. So Clarissa, I think this is an interesting question, though, just the volume of immigration. I wonder, for La Raza, I mean, once the folks who are here are legalized, who are primarily Hispanic immigrants, I mean, do you think immigration should continue at a similar level? Should it be a higher level? Should there be tons of Chinese immigrants, for instance? I mean, does La Raza have a view on that?
I think that the problem we're dealing with right now, if we go back to, a lot of people invoke 86, and I completely agree with you that part of the failure of 86 is that if you have a legal immigration system that doesn't work, then you're fostering illegality. I think part of what the bill does right now, and there's a lot of debate about whether it's enough or whether it's too regulated or not enough regulated, is that we are not necessarily talking about more immigration necessarily. We're talking about creating a system that widens the lane of legal immigration, so people come here vetted with rights and responsibilities.
And do you have a view on whether there should be more or less?
I think that we ought to see what this bill does and make sure that it has enough flexibility so that if it needs to be more, it's more. And I think some of that flexibility is there. It includes things like looking at unemployment levels in different industries so that the escalator systems on the worker programs go up and down to complement the American workforce, which is something that my organization cares about. Again, the Latino community in the United States is in a lot of the industries that people claim would be affected or not. The reality is that when there are vulnerable workers in the labor force who are not able to speak up because they're afraid that their employer is going to call, la migra, if they say anything, that hurts all workers, the wages and the conditions of all workers. So that's helpful. But it's undeniable that in order to improve conditions, we also need to do proper labor law enforcement, and immigration alone is not going to fix that.
I mean, it's interesting. I mean, this is like how coalitions actually look. Like, I don't think you and Alex agree on a whole lot. But
we agree on some critical points.
Yeah. One thing, Jose Antonio Vargas has joined us over there and is firing up his Twitter machine. But when I was looking, which he's going to be helping us out with the next couple interviews, but when I was looking at what people were tweeting at us when you talk about the Republican elites and the Republican base, maybe these were members of the Republican base, were very active on Twitter. And the overwhelming question, which I think is the question that people will shout at congressmen at town hall meetings, is, and I guess I'm interested, Mario, in sort of your response to this, is just this very basic, it's that it's in some sense unfair that folks who have broken the law, maybe it's a civil law, not a criminal law, and that's their first act in the U.S., are rewarded for it. And there's this, I mean, I think Republicans have this very distinct sense of that, and often the opposition boils down to that. And I wonder what, Mario, what you say to fellow Republicans about that.
Sure. Well, under the current bill, the way it stands, no one who's here illegally who would come forth and be able to have that temporary status until they have the criminal background check and all those things, no one would be able to get citizenship before the folks who are right now in line, even though there is no line. That's another myth that's out there. But the folks who have their applications, their citizenship applications in now, would all have to be processed before anyone who's here illegally has theirs processed under the then established new legal immigration system.
Can I just clarify one thing? Because this keeps coming up, and I think for us who deal with this issue, sometimes we do shorthand. There is a very important step before anybody gets to citizenship, right? So right now we're talking about, even though polls say the American public thinks 5 years, maybe it's how long people should wait, the Senate bill says that immigrants who are undocumented and will come forward are going to wait 10 years in a provisional status before they can apply to become legal permanent residents. So at year 10, they can apply for that. and after 3 years of being a legal permanent resident, they can apply to become citizens. So by that point, you're talking about people going through 4 criminal background checks and apply and be approved to move to the next step. So nobody gets legal permanent status until these trigger security e-verify things are in place.
And so to the question, so those 4, I think it's like 4 million or so folks who have their applications now for citizenship would all have to be processed before anyone in this category.
Kind of fairness question,
and so
Nikki,
that's not a reward. That's together with the fines and penalties, that's a punishment, and it's a fair punishment.
These are all cons. This thing about you go to the back of the line. Well, you get to wait for the back of the line. Living in the United States, which the people who are in the line back home don't get to do. So
but you've already
you
said
are
we're
rewarded.
not going to forcefully
You
hunt
are,
down
but
and
you're
deport
rewarded.
people.
The point is
so
you're
what do you
rewarded.
do?
They're in the
you
Kaus
said
plan too, though, right?
Sorry?
But I mean, also in the Mickey Kaus plan, they're here at the front of the line, right?
Well, but I don't pretend that they're not rewarded.
Got
it. They are sort of rewarded. The other thing, the security triggers do not have to happen before people get their green cards, and they get legalized right away before any of that stuff happens. As I read the law, the only thing that happens if you don't get 90% enforcement of the border, for example, is they appoint a commission, which makes recommendations. Now, it's a nothing. It's a classic Washington piece of BS.
I think the question was what's unfair. I think what's unfair about this system is that we make Americans go through a process as complicated as the IRS so that they can hire the people they want to hire, so they can bring the people they want to bring onto their property, so that they can sell the goods and services that they want to the people they want to sell. Now, I get my funny ideas about individual liberty and capitalism from the Constitution and from economics. So I have the notion that Americans, that anybody should be able to sell their labor or buy their labor in a free market between these people. And what's unfair is making Americans go through a complex legal system to engage in something that we take for granted with the rest of us.
Should we have borders at all?
Absolutely, we should have borders. I mean, this country has always had borders, even though we've had radically different immigration systems over time.
So what do you say to, I mean, you hail from the conservative movement. I mean, what do you say?
Libertarian movement.
But there. Wow, you guys packed the house. Only in D.C. But you obviously I mean, and that's your answer, because obviously there are lots of Republicans who feel very viscerally this thing about it being unfair, and that's the answer that this way is unfair to employers.
Well, it's unfair to Americans. It's unfair to consumers in this country. It's unfair to anybody who wants to work with any immigrant in this country. It's also unfair, I think, to our proud traditions in this country as an immigrant welcoming nation. I mean, we're still an immigrant welcoming nation. But compared to I always say to conservatives, let's look back to what the founders did on immigration. Let's look back to the original immigration policy of this country and get some guidance on this. Let's see what they said about it. And what did they say? Let them come.
Seize some land, displace some Indians, whatever.
Well, not on that. We can
With
change
some
it.
exception.
Some exceptions, but some proud exceptions.
I think part of the problem, the visceral reaction, is people don't have a sense of when does it stop. For example, there are people who don't qualify for legalization under this very bill who came after 2011. Marco Rubio is running around saying he's going to deport them all, okay? He's not going to deport them. You know he's not going to deport them. So they're going to be sitting there in the shadows. What are you going to do with them? The answer is we're going to have another amnesty down the road. And there's still going to be some people who sneak in, even if there's a guest worker program. What are we going to do with them? There's no sense that, especially the Latino community, has bitten the bullet and said, no, we really mean the enforcement this time. There's not going to be the continued flow from Latin America.
You're forgetting about E-Verify.
What do you think, as the representative of the Latino community here? Have you bitten the bullet?
Look, I think that the reality at the end of the day is that the Latino community is certainly tired of being the political football on this issue, because in the meantime, not only those who are immigrants are suffering very, very much with the current situation, but again, 75% who are United States citizens are being treated like second-class citizens. This is a serious issue. We want to see it resolved. But the American public is also fed up with this back and forth. Yes, so how are we going to fix it? We can go back and forth. Well, is this amnesty or not amnesty? But we're saying we're not going to massively hunt down and deport people. Okay, so then what are we going to do about it? So the thing to me is, okay, let's come up with a way that is as fair as possible, that is going to create mechanisms for people to adjust and to be vetted. And more importantly, let's make sure that we fix our legal immigration system so that it creates incentives for people to go through it rather than around it. And on this enforcement notion, frankly, you know, there's a lot of areas where we butted heads with the administration, and one of them is the notion that they're not enforcing the law, even though more than 1,000 people are getting deported every day. So, come on,
okay,
right?
Just we're running out of time here, but I was interested just kind of going down the line in a final question, and I guess particularly in light of the shitstorm the administration is currently sailing through, you know, around this, you know, like. Scandal a day, and very distracted White House, probably more distracted from this issue than they've been all year. I mean, I guess I'd be interested in each of your take on whether and how that affects this bill and whether this is going to pass this year, if you want to start.
I think it's going to pass. I think that, you know, the moral, the economic, and the political imperative are aligned. And I think that the dynamics are slightly different, where a lot of those issues that you mentioned as well as others, both parties are trying to game each other. I think in this case, there are a number of constituencies, political, economic, and otherwise, that lie beyond the partisan lines that both parties are paying attention to. And I think that's providing incredible momentum to get to the finish line.
Mario?
The good thing in terms of immigration only, with the White House being so disengaged and so you know, wrapped up in their own long list of failures, is that the only time I worry about immigration reform not passing is that if President Obama and the White House gets more involved. Because he's proven time after time that he doesn't want reform. He voted for 5 different poison pill amendments when he was United States Senator. And the fact is, every time they perk up, it only hurts the bill.
Here's
so I think
here's
he
a preview of the attempt to deny them credit when it passes.
He represents part of the Democrat Party that does not want to solve this issue.
Do you think when he signs the bill, you're going to be able to deny the Democrats credit for it?
Well, I think that that's going to depend on how many Republicans and how many conservatives proactively and positively engage in this process the way Marco Rubio has.
Mm-hmm. Alex?
I think there's a very good chance it's going to pass the Senate. The House is a much more interesting prospect. There are a lot more divergent opinions over in the House. There's opinions amongst a lot of people in the House that the guest worker portion, the increase in the future flows, is not good enough and not large enough. That's one notion that's very prevalent in the House of Representatives. There are other worries there about a lot of the stuff that Mickey has talked about with enforcement on that side. But I'm not going to put money on it one way or the other.
What do you think, Mickey? Does the IRS stop this?
I actually think these distracting scandals help the bill's chances of passage. The problem with this bill is the elites like it, the voters don't like it. Every time there's publicity, every time it's at center stage, its chances of passage get worse. The more you look at it as Jim DeMint, who is an absent presence here, I think.
Kind of like Elijah in the chair.
As Jim DeMint says, the more voters find out about it, the less they like it. So anything that distracts attention from it actually helps it. If it passes, it's going to be an inside job. I'd say it's 50-50.
Well, thank you guys so much for turning up for this. Thank you all for coming. We're going to resume at 7:30 with the more applause.
Thank you.
We'll resume at 7:30 with Luis Fortunio, the former governor of Puerto Rico, and then with Congressman Joaquin Castro from Texas. Thank you, guys.
You did.